The doors to the grand hall parted with a silence that felt deliberate, not the gentle quiet of an empty room, but the kind that falls when a crowd decides, all at once, to hold its breath. She felt it the moment she stepped inside. Not fear, not admiration, something colder than both. They were already watching before she crossed the threshold. Men in tailored black suits with eyes like locked vaults, women draped in jewels they hadn't earned alone. A room full of people who had survived by knowing, instantly, who mattered and who didn't. And in that single, sweeping glance across the hall, they had already decided about her. A paper wife, foreign decoration, she won't last the season. Her name was Maria, and she walked forward anyway. She wore an ivory silk gown, simple in its cut, regal in its stillness. Against the chandelier light, her deep brown skin glowed like warm amber, unhurried, unashamed. Her hair, a structured crown of natural curls, framed a face that carried no performance, no desperate smile, no apology in her eyes. Just the kind of composed stillness that comes not from confidence, but from surviving things that should have broken you. Beside her walked Min-jae Kang, Korea's most feared name in rooms where fear was currency. He was tall, dressed in an obsidian suit, so precisely fitted it looked carved from authority itself. His posture didn't shift for anyone. His jaw was set. His gaze moved through the room like surveillance cataloging, calculating, revealing nothing. A faint scar curved through his left eyebrow, a thin white line that told a story no one dared ask about. His hands were still at his sides, not relaxed, still, the way a weapon is still. They moved together through a hall that gleamed like it had been built to intimidate. Black marble floors reflected the crystal above. The chandeliers dripped with cold light. Gold fixtures framed walls that held no warmth. This was not a home. This was a throne room dressed as a banquet hall, and every person inside it had paid for their seat in ways that would never see daylight. Maria had not paid in that currency. She had paid in something far more costly. Her brother sat in a prison cell tonight, convicted of a crime he did not commit, framed by the same political machine whose fingerprints were all over this very room. She had signed the contract, said the vows, worn the ring, not for status, not for safety. She had walked into the lion's den because it was the only door that led to justice, and she was willing to bleed for it quietly, for as long as it took. No one in this hall knew that yet. To them she was a decoration, a legal shield, a foreigner Min-jae had married to protect his assets from political seizure, someone temporary, someone disposable. They raised their glasses and smiled their practiced smiles, and the whispers curled around her like smoke low enough to deny, sharp enough to sting. She let them. She smiled back with the patience of someone who already knew how the story ends. Soon the syndicate's financial accounts will be drained, millions, gone, confidential roots exposed. And the name on everyone's lips, the name they will drag before the council and demand blood for, will be hers. Before this night closes, Min-jae Kang will descend from his seat of power, and the room will stop breathing. And then Maria will step forward. Not as the paper wife they signed into existence, not as a placeholder, not as something fragile enough to be erased. She will stand in full view of the same men who built their power on intimidation and silence, and she will not lower her eyes. Because she understands them now, their patterns, their arrogance, their need to believe no one is watching closely enough to challenge them. And when she speaks, it won't be to defend herself. It will be to dismantle them. In that moment, the truth will settle in the room like a blade pressed against skin. Maria is not someone to be protected from wickedness. She is someone wickedness should have feared first. Here is the question only you can answer. Have you ever done the right thing in a room full of people who had already decided you were wrong and chosen to stay anyway? Before we go further into Maria's story, pause right now and like this video and tell me in the comments, would you have signed that contract to save someone you love? I love seeing this community show up for stories that hit different. Every like helps stories like this reach someone who needs them tonight. So take a breath, get comfortable, because we are just getting started. Let's begin. The document sat on the table between them like a verdict. 12 pages, dense legal language. 2 signature lines at the bottom, one already filled in with the sharp, controlled script of Min-jae Kang. The other is still blank, waiting for her. Maria sat across from his attorney in a glass-walled conference room on the 43rd floor of a building she had never been inside before that morning. Outside, Seoul stretched endlessly in every direction, gray towers, neon signs, a city that never lowered its voice. Inside, the room was silent except for the hum of climate control and the soft tick of an expensive wall clock. She had been given 30 minutes to review the contract. She had read it 4 times. The terms were precise. The marriage would be legally registered and publicly presented as genuine. She would reside in the Kang estate. She would attend required functions. She would not speak to media, law enforcement, or foreign officials without prior clearance. In exchange, she would receive monthly compensation, private security, and the clause she had read most carefully, full legal support toward the review and appeal of her brother's criminal case. That last line was the only reason she was still sitting in the chair. Her brother's name was David. He was 24 years old. He had worked as a junior accountant at a mid-level logistics firm in the city, a job he had taken seriously, a life he had been building carefully. 3 months ago, he was arrested on charges of financial fraud, large-scale embezzlement, the kind that carried a minimum sentence of 7 years. The evidence against him had been presented as overwhelming: transaction records, email trails, digital signatures that all bore his name. But Maria knew her brother. She knew the way he kept handwritten budget notes, because he didn't fully trust spreadsheets. She knew he called her every Sunday evening without fail. She knew that the morning of his arrest, he had sent her a voice message asking if she wanted him to bring food when he visited that weekend. A man planning to disappear with stolen millions does not ask about dinner. She had spent weeks trying to understand what had happened quietly, carefully, without resources. What she found, pieced together through a former colleague of David's who was too frightened to speak loudly, was that the firm had been used as a laundering channel by political investors who needed distance from their money. When the operation attracted outside scrutiny, they needed someone to absorb the blame. David's access credentials, his proximity to the accounts, his junior status, all of it made him a clean and convenient target. He had been framed not because he was guilty, but because he was close enough to the evidence and powerless enough to be sacrificed. The people behind it had connections that made conventional legal channels nearly impossible for someone like Maria to navigate alone. Min-jae Kang had connections of a different kind entirely. She signed the contract. See, sometimes survival forces you into choices that look like surrender to others, but not every signature is submission. Some are strategies written in silence. What looks like giving up your freedom can, in reality, be a calculated trade made by someone who refuses to let circumstances decide everything. She told herself it was strategy, not surrender. She told herself she was not selling anything, she was spending what she had to spend to get her brother home. She folded the copy they gave her, placed it in her bag, and did not cry until she was in the elevator going down, alone, her reflection fractured across the polished metal doors. The estate was larger than she had imagined, not flashy in the way she had expected, no excess for the sake of display. It was a compound of precise, restrained architecture set behind walls that said everything without announcing anything. Security personnel moved like shadows. Staff kept their eyes appropriately lowered. The interior was dark wood, stone floors, and furniture chosen for authority rather than comfort. She was given a wing of her own, a bedroom, a sitting room, a private bathroom tiled in gray marble. It was beautiful in the way a 5-star hotel is beautiful, flawless, impersonal, and belonging entirely to someone else. A housekeeper named Mrs. O showed her where things were kept. Her tone was professional. Her eyes said something different. The first dinner was the clearest education she received about her position. Min-jae sat at the head of a long table. 3 of his senior advisors were present, men who wore their power in the set of their shoulders and the careful flatness of their expressions. Maria sat to Min-jae's right, where a wife would sit. No one addressed her directly for the first 40 minutes. When one of the advisors finally turned to her, it was to ask, in polite and perfectly measured Korean, whether she found the food acceptable. It was not a question about food. It was a measurement. A small test of whether she understood that she was a guest at a table that was not hers. She answered in Korean, calmly, that the food was excellent. The advisor's expression shifted barely, but she caught it. He had not expected her to understand the language, let alone respond in it. She had been studying for 2 years, quietly, for reasons that had nothing to do with this marriage. Min-jae said nothing, but she noticed that he heard. The weeks that followed had a particular texture to them, the texture of being present inside spaces that had been built to exclude you. Syndicate members came and went from the estate for meetings she was not invited to attend. When she passed associates in hallways, greetings were given that were technically polite and emotionally absent. In group settings, conversations shifted or simplified in her presence not overtly, but in the way water moves around an object placed in its path. She was not hated, she was not threatened. She was made irrelevant, and she was beginning to understand that irrelevance, in an environment like this one, carried its own particular danger. She filled her days with structure, because structure was the only thing keeping the grief from spreading. She woke early. She reviewed what she could find about David's case from the documents his attorney had shared. She exercised, she ate her meals. She sat in her room in the evenings and read, or tried to, while the sounds of the estate moved around her like a current she was not part of. Minjae was present in the house but rarely visible to her. They had a functional understanding. They appeared together when required, exchanged necessary information through his assistant, and maintained the correct social distance of two people who were, for all practical purposes, strangers sharing a last name. He was never cruel. He was simply not there in any way that mattered. She told herself she could endure it. She had endured harder things. Then the accusation came. She did not hear it directly at first. She heard it the way you hear bad news, in a closed environment, in the way a room changes temperature before anyone speaks, in the way eyes that were already cold find a new and specific reason to stay that way. The syndicate's financial network had been compromised. Routing information for 3 major transaction channels had been leaked, information that, according to the internal report, she was not supposed to see but which Mrs. O, left on the dining table by what Maria would later understand was not an accident, had been accessed from inside the estate. Her name was not spoken aloud at first. It didn't need to be. She was the newest variable. She was the unknown quantity. She was the woman no one had wanted inside the compound, and whose presence had been tolerated as a political necessity. When something breaks, people look first at whatever doesn't belong. Evidence materialized with a speed that felt prepared rather than discovered. Access logs showing her credentials near the financial servers. A timeline that placed her in corridors she had no legitimate reason to enter. A staff member, someone she recognized from her second week at the estate, came forward to say he had seen her near the administrative offices late at night. She had been in her room that night. She had been awake. Yes, sleep had become difficult, but she had been in her room, reading, alone, with no witness. That absence of a witness is what made the accusation so clean. Minjae received the report privately. She was not told what decision had been reached in that meeting. She was told, through his assistant, that her access to the estate's common areas would be temporarily restricted while an internal review was conducted. She was to remain in her wing. She stood in her sitting room after the assistant left and let the reality of it settle over her slowly, the way cold does starting at the surface and moving inward. She had not expected gratitude. She had not expected warmth. But she had believed, somewhere beneath the practical surface of this arrangement, that she was inside it as an equal party that the contract had created, if nothing else, a mutual obligation. What she understood now was that she had been inside it the way a document is inside a filing cabinet, useful when needed, otherwise stored. She sat down in the chair by the window and looked out at the garden below, perfectly maintained, every hedge in its place, nothing growing that hadn't been permitted to grow, and she thought about David. She thought about what it meant to be held in a place not because of anything you had done, but because of what was convenient for someone else. She thought, I will not become someone who waits to be rescued. The restriction of her movement was intended to contain her. Instead, it removed the last performance she had been maintaining, the performance of being fine, of moving through this house with composure and patience and quiet hope. With that stripped away, she had nothing left to do but think clearly. And thinking clearly, she began to see the shape of what had been done to her. The staff who brought her meals became the first thread she pulled carefully, not dramatically, not with questions that would frighten them. Simply with attention, the kind of attention most people in her position would have been too proud or too frightened to offer. She learned their names. She thanked them in ways that were specific rather than reflexive. When the young woman who brought her evening tea, a girl no older than 20, who kept her expression locked, but whose hands were always slightly tense, spilled a small amount on the tray, and flinched as though waiting for a consequence that would cost her, Maria simply said, quietly, in Korean, "Please don't worry, it's only tea." The girl looked up. It was such a small thing. But in a house where everyone moved in fear of taking up too much space, being seen without consequence felt extraordinary. Loyalty does not always come from authority. It often comes from recognition. When you treat people as invisible, you lose them. When you see them clearly, even briefly, you gain access to truths power structures cannot control. Her name was Jisoo. She began leaving Maria's tray a few minutes later than the others, a small window of time that didn't appear in any schedule. She did not say much at first, but she began to linger. And in the lingering, things were exchanged that changed the shape of everything. It was Jisoo who told her, in pieces, across several evenings, that Mrs. O had not left that report on the table by accident. That there were others on the lower staff who had watched the accusation unfold and felt the wrongness of it in their bones, even if they couldn't name the wrongness out loud. That the access logs had been contested quietly, one of the network technicians had flagged an inconsistency in the timestamp data and been told to file it away and say nothing. That there was a name, spoken only in the cautious shorthand of people afraid to be overheard, attached to the origin of everything that was going wrong. Director Park. Maria did not react visibly when she heard the name. She had learned, in the weeks inside this house, that composure was its own form of armor. She stored the name carefully. She asked Jisoo nothing more about it that night. But she began to understand that she was not simply a victim of this situation. She was, in fact, positioned by accident, or by something she was not yet ready to call providence, closer to the truth than anyone else in this house realized. She was isolated. She was accused. She was being managed like a liability. And none of them had considered the possibility that a woman who had already survived a justice system powerful enough to imprison her innocent brother might know how to survive this too, not by fighting loudly, but by paying attention to everything they had decided was beneath their notice. The staff were not nothing. The junior technician who had flagged the inconsistency was not nothing. The housekeeper who had placed a report where Maria could find it was not nothing. They were people who had been made to feel like furniture inside a house that ran on power. And Maria, who had never once in her life believed that power alone made someone important, began to understand that the loyalty of people who have been overlooked is one of the most durable forces that exist. She was in her chair by the window when this settled in her fully. Outside, the garden held its perfect shape in the evening light. Inside, something in Maria shifted, not dramatically, not with the sharp crack of resolution, but quietly, the way a foundation settles before it holds. She reached for the notebook she kept beside her chair and opened it to a fresh page. She had not spoken yet about what she suspected. She had not gone to Minjae, had not demanded to be heard, had not let her composure fracture in front of any of the people who would have used that fracture against her. She had given this house her silence, her patience, and her dignity. Now she was going to give it something else. The truth, and she would build it carefully, page by page, until it could not be ignored. The notebook filled slowly, page by page, across 5 days. Maria worked the way she had always worked when the stakes were highest, methodically, without rushing, without allowing the fear underneath to dictate the pace of what was above it. She wrote down everything Jisoo had told her, cross-referenced against what she already knew about the structure of the syndicate's financial operations, from the documents she had studied during her first weeks in the estate. She was not a forensic accountant. She was not an investigator. But she was someone who had spent months dissecting the manufactured evidence used to imprison her brother, and that process had taught her one enduring lesson: corruption, no matter how sophisticated, always leaves a pattern, not because the people behind it are careless, because they are arrogant, because they believe the people beneath them are not watching. The technician's name was Hyun-soo. He was 26, worked the overnight network maintenance shift, and had flagged a timestamp inconsistency in the access logs, a 12-minute gap that should not have existed if the data had been recorded in real time. He had been told by his direct supervisor to discard the flag, reclassify it as a system error, and document nothing. He had done exactly that. But he had also, quietly, kept a personal copy of the original flag on an encrypted drive he kept in his locker. It was Mrs. O who connected them, in the careful, deniable way of someone who had spent decades learning how to move information through a house without being seen to move it. She arranged for Hyun-soo to deliver a routine systems update to the terminal in Maria's sitting room, a task that required him to be present for approximately 20 minutes. During those 20 minutes, while the screen ran its update, He told her what he had found, and why he had been afraid to say it out loud. Maria listened to everything. She asked 3 questions, all of them precise. Then she thanked him in a way that acknowledged what the act of speaking had cost him, and she let him leave. She sat with what she now knew, and let it organize itself clearly in her mind. Director Park had not simply framed her. He had constructed something far older and far larger. The financial routing information that had been leaked, the leak she had been accused of enabling, had originated from servers accessible only to senior leadership. The timestamp manipulation that Hyun-soo had identified pointed to an access window that corresponded exactly with Director Park's own scheduled presence in the building. More than that, the political network behind the leak, the investors who had used the financial channels being exposed, were the same network that had used David's firm as a laundering vehicle, the same apparatus, the same hands. Director Park was not simply Min Jae's corrupt lieutenant. He was a connector point between the syndicate and the political infrastructure that had destroyed her brother's life. He had framed Maria not only to remove her from the equation, but to prevent the possibility that she, a woman with every reason to investigate that political network and knowledge enough to recognize its fingerprints, might eventually find the thread that led back to him. She had been removed before she became dangerous. What he had not calculated was that isolation, for a woman like Maria, was not a cage. It was a library. She organized her findings with the care of someone who understood that evidence without structure is only suspicion. She wrote clearly, sourced every claim to a specific document or testimony, and made certain that nothing in the notebook could be dismissed as emotional accusation. Then she thought carefully about what came next, and she understood, without comfort, that what came next required the right hands. She could not deliver this to Min Jae directly. Her access to him had been reduced to a formality. Any approach she made would be filtered through people who answered to Director Park's influence. She could not reach the outside without triggering the surveillance protocols she knew the estate maintained. She was, in the most technical sense, trapped not by walls, but by the absence of any channel that had not already been compromised. But Mrs. O had been in this house for 30 years, and there were channels Mrs. O knew that had never appeared on any protocol. Maria put the notebook under the loose tile beneath the window seat that Jisoo had quietly shown her one evening, saying only that the previous occupant of the room had used it, and that some things were worth keeping out of sight. Then she waited, because sometimes waiting is not passivity. Sometimes it is the last form of control available to you, and the discipline required to hold it without flinching is its own kind of strength. The rumors reached her the way everything reached her in that house indirectly, through the temperature of the rooms and the behavior of the people moving through them. Jisoo arrived with her evening tea 3 nights later and set the tray down without her usual small pause. Her hands were steady, but her shoulders were held too carefully, the way a person holds themselves when they are working very hard not to show something. Maria waited. "There is talk," Jisoo said, finally, not looking up, "about a council meeting, a formal one." She paused. "About you." Maria set down her cup. "What kind of formal?" Jisoo did not answer directly, but the way she finally looked up with an expression that was trying to be neutral and failing at the edges told Maria everything the words had not. She had known this was a possibility. She had considered it in the abstract, in the way you consider all the worst outcomes of a situation when you are trying to think clearly about risk. But knowing something is possible and hearing it confirmed are 2 different experiences, and she sat with the difference for a moment before letting it settle into something she could work with. They were going to convene a formal judgment. They were going to present the evidence, the planted logs, the manipulated timestamps. The witness account, and the council was going to deliberate on what happened to people inside the syndicate's world who were found to have betrayed it. She thought about David in his cell. She thought about the Sunday evening calls she had not been able to make since coming to this estate. She thought about the notebook under the tile. She thought, the truth exists. That is not nothing. She slept that night with the particular stillness of someone who has resolved something they cannot yet explain. The council chamber was underground, not metaphorically, but literally, accessed through a corridor beneath the estate's east wing that Maria had never been permitted to enter. She was escorted there by 2 men who said nothing, and walked at a distance calibrated to communicate that this was not an invitation. The room itself was circular, with tiered seating arranged in a configuration that made clear, immediately, Who held authority and who was being judged? Min-jae sat at the highest tier, elevated above the rest. Below him, arranged in descending levels, sat 9 members of the inner council. Director Park occupied the seat nearest Min-jae's, left a position of proximity that, Maria now understood, had been carefully constructed over years. She was placed at the center of the room, alone, no chair. The evidence was presented methodically. A council member she did not recognize by name read from a prepared document the access logs, the timeline, the witness statement. Director Park supplemented it twice, adding context with the smooth precision of someone who had rehearsed the additions. His voice was measured. His expression carried the gravity of a man who found the situation regrettable but necessary. He was very good at this. He had been doing it, Maria now knew, for a very long time. When the presentation concluded, Maria was offered the floor to respond. She took it without hesitation and without theater. She spoke for 11 minutes. She did not accuse. She presented specific timestamps, specific access credentials, specific routing paths through the financial architecture that pointed to a terminal and a clearance level that was not hers. She had memorized the notebook entirely. She recited from it with the precision of someone who had spent years working with documents whose every detail mattered, and she watched the room's quality of attention shift around her as she spoke. The chamber was quiet in a different way when she finished. She watched Min-jae's face throughout. It was controlled. He had not built what he had built by allowing rooms to read him, but there were things in his eyes that could not be entirely suppressed. He had received a copy of her findings that morning, delivered to his private office through a channel that bypassed Director Park entirely. Mrs. O had found the way, because Mrs. O had spent 30 years in this house learning every way there was. He had read the notebook before entering this room. What Maria now recited aloud confirmed in front of witnesses what the documents had already told him privately. The deliberation lasted 2 hours. She was escorted to a waiting room during that time, a bare anteroom with a single window that looked out onto stone, and sat straight-backed in a chair, with her hands folded, not speaking to the men at the door, not allowing herself the small relief of visible anxiety. She thought about structure. She thought about patience. She thought about David, who had sat in a different kind of waiting room for a much longer time, and what it had required of him to hold himself intact through that. She thought about the way truth, given enough precision and time, tends to find a surface to rest on. She had given it both. The rest was not hers to control, and she had arrived at that understanding, not easily but completely, in the long, careful nights when she was building the thing she had just delivered into the hands of a room that had the power to act on it or ignore it entirely. When she was called back, Director Park's seat was empty. She did not allow herself to react to this. She stood at the center of the room and waited. Min-jae spoke clearly and without ceremony. He stated what the review had determined, that the access logs presented as evidence had been altered, that the timestamp manipulation pointed to a clearance level she had never held, that the witness account had been secured through financial arrangement rather than observation. He stated that the judgment against her was dissolved and that the investigation would proceed in the direction the evidence required. He did not make a performance of it. He simply stated the truth, with precision, in front of everyone who had been prepared to condemn her, and let that carry its own weight. It was enough. In a room built on power, the absence of theater was itself a statement. Director Park had miscalculated in the way that men of his type often do. He had assumed the people beneath him lacked both the will and the means to act. When his detention became known, handled with the administrative efficiency of an organization closing a wound, rather than announce dramatically, the network he had assembled began, slowly and unevenly, to develop fractures, not all at once. The men who had operated under his influence weighed their options with the careful self-interest that had kept them functional inside such a structure, and over months, some of them produced what they knew. Others did not, and the investigation worked around them by other means. It was not clean, it was not swift. There were figures who maintained their silence successfully and were never reached. There were witnesses who recanted. There were legal delays that stretched weeks into months, and months into something that required a particular discipline to endure, without losing the thread of what had been started. It proceeded with exactly the grinding, unglamorous quality of institutional correction, without elegance, without resolution, but with accumulating and irreversible weight. Among the cases drawn into that weight was the conviction of a 24-year-old junior accountant imprisoned on charges of financial fraud, charges built on manipulated transaction records, fabricated email trails, and digital signatures that an independent forensic audit determined had been placed without his knowledge or authorization. The legal process of review took 14 months. There were delays, procedural complications, points at which Maria sat across from lawyers and held herself still against the urge to force something that could not be safely forced. David was released on a gray Tuesday morning. She was at the gate when he walked out. He had lost weight she did not remember him losing, and gained a stillness in his face that she recognized because she had developed a version of it herself. He looked older than she remembered, and she imagined she appeared the same to him. They stood in the pale morning light and held on to each other without speaking for a long time, because some things do not need to be said to be true, and after 14 months, neither had any interest in filling the silence with anything less than what it deserved. She told him everything eventually over days, in pieces, in the way that the hardest truths are best told. He listened the way he had always listened, with complete attention and without flinching, and when she finished, he said quietly that he was sorry she had carried it so heavily. She told him that it had not been a weight in the end. It had been a direction. The restructuring of the empire took longer than anyone expected and proceeded more honestly than many predicted. Min-jae had spent years understanding the corruption around him and had known, longer than he had admitted even to himself, that the architecture of his organization contained rot that authority alone could not remove. What it required was a different kind of foundation, one built on accountability, which holds, rather than fear, which erodes. Maria became part of that process not because she was asked to, but because she was already doing it. The loyalty of the staff of Jisoo, of Mrs. O, of Hyunsu, of the others who had moved quietly through the house, and watched and helped in the small ways available to them transformed when the crisis passed into something more durable than survival. It became the foundation of something she had not expected to build in a place like this. Trust extended in both directions, between people who had all paid a price to be present. She established a formal channel through which lower-level staff could raise concerns without consequence. She worked with legal teams to implement oversight protocols that removed single points of control. The relationship between her and Min-jae shifted with the same incremental quality, not in a single moment, but across many small ones, each built on having seen what the other was capable of when conditions were designed to break it. Small changes, structural ones. The kind that do not announce themselves but alter how power moves through an organization over time. The banquet came a year later. Same hall, black marble floors, crystal chandeliers. Cold light made warm by the presence of people whose relationship to the room had changed. Maria stood at the entrance the way she had stood there the first night, composed, straight, her presence requiring no announcement. But the room did not whisper this time. People rose not in the formal way of ceremony, but in the unrehearsed way of those who feel something true and respond to it without being told to. The movement spread through the hall until the standing silence it created was nothing like that first evening. Not cold, not designed to diminish. It was recognition, a room that had watched something unfold over a long and difficult year, and now understood what it had been witnessing. Min-jae walked beside her. The distance between them was not the managed distance of a legal arrangement, but the honest distance of two people who had seen each other clearly under the worst conditions and chosen, with full information, to remain. She thought of the woman who had walked into this room the first time, the weight she carried, the silence she maintained, the patience spent like a resource she wasn't certain she had enough of. She thought of every morning at the window with her notebook, building truth from scraps, refusing to let the size of the opposition convince her that her position was without leverage. She had not survived this by being loud. She had survived it by being precise, by knowing what mattered and protecting it with everything available to her. By understanding that the people who overlook you are often the most exposed to what you can do. That dignity maintained under pressure is not weakness performing as strength, it is strength. That what you give in truth and loyalty and quiet, consistent care does not disappear. It accumulates, it builds. And when the moment arrives that requires it to be visible, it rises in ways that cannot be manufactured or performed. She stood in the room that had once whispered her name like a dismissal, and let the standing silence fill her completely. What she had given had come back, not as a reward, as a consequence, the natural result of planting real things in difficult ground and refusing to uproot them before they could grow. The chandeliers above caught the light exactly as they always had. But the room beneath them was different now, and so was she.